In the annals of Roman history, few names have stirred such a mixture of fascination and revulsion as Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, known forever by the nickname Caligula or Little Boots. His reign began with celebrations so exuberant that Rome seemed to believe its golden age had returned. And in those first shining months of 37 CE, the promise did not appear misplaced. Caligula was the son of Germanicus, the empire's most beloved general, whose sudden death years earlier had plunged Rome into grief. Raised in the camps of the legions, the young Gaius grew up adored by soldiers who dressed him in miniature armor and boots, giving him the affectionate name that would outlive his official titles. To the people of Rome, weary of Tiberius's paranoia and bloodstained, last year's Caligula seemed a deliverer, young, charismatic, and untainted by the cynicism of politics. When he took the throne on March 18, 37 CE, Rome erupted in joy. Exiles were recalled, political prisoners released, secret files of denunciations burned. He cut certain taxes, staged grand games in the circus, and distributed generous donatives to the soldiers, securing both the love of the people and the loyalty of the legions. For a moment it seemed Rome had found the rarest of rulers, an emperor both popular and benevolent. Ancient writers describe him walking among the citizens, greeting them like an equal, promising a reign of openness after decades of suspicion and repression. Yet, beneath this glowing image, shadows were already forming. His devotion to his sisters, especially Drusilla, went far beyond the boundaries of Roman decorum. Honours normally reserved for the emperor himself were extended to them, leaving even jaded senators shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Foreign envoys trained to read the subtleties of power noted how the emperor paraded his sisters before them with unsettling intimacy. To most Romans, it was strange but forgivable. After all, was it not a relief to see an emperor who loved openly after Tiberius had hidden on Capri, shrouded in secrecy and cruelty? The turning point came swiftly. In the autumn of 37 CE, mere months after his accession, Caligula fell gravely ill. The empire held its breath. Citizens filled temples with offerings vowing their own lives for the survival of their young prince. Some whispered that the gods would never be so cruel as to rob Rome twice of a son of Germanicus. When Caligula recovered, the relief was overwhelming. Temples resounded with hymns, sacrifices flowed, and tears of joy marked the city's streets. But the man who rose from that sickbed was not the same one who had laid upon it. Ancient sources differ on what happened during those fevered weeks. Some believed he suffered encephalitis, leaving permanent damage to his mind. Others whispered of visions of voices, convincing him that he was more than mortal, that he was divine. Philo of Alexandria, who met him shortly after his recovery, described a man whose eyes burned with an unnatural fire, whose speech lurched between manic bursts of energy and chilling silences. Whatever the cause, the transformation was undeniable. The generous prince, who had walked freely among the people, now withdrew into an aura of menace. The jovial companion of the Senate returned to the Curia not as a partner, but as a master. Rome, which had once celebrated the dawn of renewal, began to glimpse the outlines of a nightmare. It was as though illness had peeled away his humanity, leaving behind something raw, unpredictable, and dangerous. And so in the span of a single year, the city that had cheered itself hoarse at his accession would find itself whispering in fear, wondering what sort of monster the gods had set upon the imperial throne. In the months following his recovery, Caligula's behavior began to shift from the eccentric to the unsettling. Rome had always tolerated oddities in its rulers. Augustus was cold and calculating, Tiberius brooding and secretive. But Caligula's changes were different, more theatrical, more invasive. Where once he had offered Rome a vision of renewal, he now began to probe its most sacred boundaries. The first murmurs of unease centered on his sisters. His affection for Drusilla, the eldest and most beloved, was no secret, but the intensity of his devotion raised eyebrows. He insisted she be accorded public honors typically reserved for the emperor himself. At banquets, his hand lingered on her shoulder as though she were his consort. During foreign delegations, he paraded her alongside him with a pride that seemed less familial than proprietorial. Even the jaded courtiers of Rome, who had seen their share of scandal, whispered in discomfort. Yet in a city where imperial power was absolute unease, did not translate into open defiance. To understand why this disturbed Roman society so deeply, one must remember how central family and pieta's sacred duty were to their moral framework. Rome could endure brutality in its rulers. What it could not easily endure was the pollution of its most hallowed bonds. Incest was not simply taboo. It was a religious violation, a stain upon the household gods themselves. That Caligula flirted with this boundary in public before senators and envoys was not merely scandalous, it was a declaration that no tradition, however sacred, would restrain him. Ancient sources hint at the change in his persona after illness, eyes flashing with feverish intensity, sudden outbursts of manic joy or volcanic rage. Philo of Alexandria described him as a man caught between divinity and madness, claiming powers and honors as though he were more than human. For a Roman audience, this was disorienting. Unlike the monarchies of the East, where rulers such as the Ptolemies of Egypt had long declared themselves gods, Rome prided itself on restraint. Even Augustus, who wielded more power than any mortal before him, avoided divine pretensions while alive. The Senate had deified emperors only after death, a compromise between tradition and imperial reality. Caligula ignored such boundaries. He began to speak openly of his own divinity, as though the fever had stripped away the last vestiges of mortal humility. Rumors swirled that he conversed with gods at night, that he demanded temples be dedicated in his honor. The Romans had seen cults to emperors in the provinces, but to witness their ruler in the flesh, claim divine honors in the capital itself, was profoundly disturbing. It was as if the invisible veil that separated human and divine a veil Rome carefully maintained had been torn apart by the very man entrusted to uphold it. Still, for many, the shift could be explained away. Rome had long endured the eccentricities of power. Perhaps Caligula was merely extravagant. Perhaps his gestures toward his sisters were symbolic. Perhaps his divine claims were rhetorical flourish. The people wanted to believe this, for the alternative was too frightening to confront, that the emperor's illness had not only changed him, but unmoored him from every tether of Roman order. Yet in hindsight, those first cracks in his facade revealed everything that was to come. The emperor who dared to parade his sisters as consorts, who dared to blur the line between man and God, had already signaled the path down which he would drag Rome, a path where no boundary was sacred, no tradition inviolable, and no shame sufficient to restrain him. What began as whispers within the palace soon spilled into the streets of Rome. Caligula's indulgences, once contained behind gilded doors, grew bolder until secrecy no longer interested him. The young emperor, who had once walked among the people, now demanded that the people, and especially the Senate, walk into his world of orchestrated humiliation. At first these were rumors, strange gatherings held at night, laughter echoing through marble halls, slaves entering the emperor's chambers and leaving with vacant eyes. Servants whispered of entertainments too grotesque to describe aloud. But as weeks turned to months, privacy ceased to matter. Caligula transformed the very heart of Roman political life, the banquet table, into a stage for degradation. Invitations to dine with the emperor became obligations. Senators who once prided themselves on their dignity found themselves seated at feasts where the line between celebration and debauchery was deliberately erased. What began as wine-soaked evenings dissolved into orgies where noble families were compelled to play their part. The wives and daughters of Rome's highest officials were paraded as though they were prizes in a grotesque auction. Men who had faced Carthage and Parthia with steel in hand now sat frozen, forced to applaud or risk ruin as their families were exposed to the emperor's whims. It was not merely the acts themselves that horrified Rome, but their public nature. Roman culture had always acknowledged that vice existed indeed. Many emperors indulged in excess. But it was understood that private failings must be kept private. Honor, or dignitas, was the invisible armor that bound the Senate together. To strip a senator of his family's dignity in front of his peers was to strike at the foundation of Rome's elite. Caligula understood this with chilling clarity. By forcing men of power to witness the violation of their loved ones, he ensured their complicity. Silence became survival. To speak out was to admit what one had endured, to risk shame as much as punishment. And so degradation became not a side effect of his reign, but its central mechanism of control. Historians later struggled to describe these scenes without recoiling. Suetonius, writing decades after, admitted he could not bring himself to record the full extent of what transpired. But enough fragments remain to show the calculated cruelty dinners where the emperor would call out a senator's wife by name, command her to his bedchamber mid-feast, and then return her to the table, forcing her husband to offer polite thanks for the honor. In those moments, it was not desire that motivated Caligula, but domination. The imperial palace itself began to change. No longer merely a residence, it became what one horrified observer called a brothel of unimaginable depravity. Rooms were set aside, decorated not with art or marble, but with contraptions designed for pleasure and shame. Attendance at these spectacles was not optional. Refusal could mean charges of treason, exile, or execution. Compliance, however, brought no safety, only the gnawing certainty that survival was bought at the cost of honor. Rome had long been acquainted with tyranny, but this was something different. Previous rulers killed their enemies. Caligula forced them to live to participate, to degrade themselves and those they loved, until resistance seemed not only dangerous, but impossible. By transforming private vice into public theatre, he rewrote the language of power. Violence could wound the body. Humiliation could enslave the soul. And in the candlelit halls of the Palatine, where senators once debated the fate of nations, Rome's proudest families learned what it meant to be spectators and actors in their own debasement. If Caligula's feasts and public humiliations had been nothing more than moments of excess, they might have passed into rumour and been forgotten with time. But what made his reign uniquely terrifying was not the indulgence itself, but the order with which it was executed. This was not chaos, it was administration. Palace scribes trained to record tax rolls, and military dispatches were repurposed to catalogue the degradations of Rome's nobility. Meticulous records were kept: who attended, what acts they performed, how they reacted, whether they showed tears, reluctance, or feigned pleasure. These notes were written with the same detached precision used to record grain shipments from Egypt. Human dignity had become a ledger entry. Fragments of these documents, preserved despite later purges, reveal a chilling picture. Victims were categorized almost like subjects in an experiment. Those who resisted, those who submitted, those who broke quickly, those who clung to pride. The emperor studied these records carefully, marking them with observations in his own hand. Ancient writers describe Caligula as obsessed with discovering which forms of humiliation yielded the deepest despair. He was not merely indulging desire, he was learning, perfecting, refining cruelty. In this, he twisted one of Rome's greatest strengths into a weapon: The Roman state prided itself on efficiency. Its armies were disciplined, its tax system precise, its legal code respected across continents. Caligula applied that same discipline to the administration of shame. What had once organized empire now organized degradation. Invoices for furniture became requisitions for devices of pleasure. Lists of grain supplies became schedules of noble women summoned to his chambers. For those forced to endure it, the horror lay not only in the acts themselves, but in their normalization. By reducing the unthinkable to paperwork, Caligula robbed his victims of even the comfort of believing their suffering was extraordinary. To see one's humiliation recorded in ink filed alongside fiscal accounts and military reports was to realize that Rome's institutions themselves had been corrupted to enshrine dishonor. This bureaucratic cruelty extended beyond the palace walls. Governors in the provinces received orders to prepare tributes for the emperor's visits. They too sent back lists, names of youths gathered, families punished for refusal, villages stripped bare to satisfy imperial appetites. Local administrators, once accountable for justice and tax collection, now competed to deliver the most pleasing offerings, their efficiency measured not in revenue but in submission. The system bred silence. When everyone's degradation was documented, no one could risk exposure. Senators who might have plotted rebellion knew their secrets were inked in imperial ledgers. Families who dreamed of escape realized their humiliation was already recorded, ready to be unveiled as evidence of complicity. The shame became communal, woven into the very fabric of Roman governance. Modern historians often pause here, noting the paradox. Rome, which had built its greatness on discipline, law, and administration, now saw those same virtues weaponized against itself. What had once been tools of empire were inverted into chains of humiliation. The city that prided itself on law and order was paralyzed not by violence, but by the cold efficiency of its own record keepers. It is one thing to suffer cruelty and chaos. It is another to find it stamped, sealed, and filed as if it were as ordinary as a tax assessment. For Caligula, this was the ultimate triumph, to make the monstrous mundane to bureaucratize dishonor, until even the proudest senators no longer knew where Rome ended and the nightmare began. Of all Caligula's transgressions, none scandalized Rome more than his relationships with his sisters. Drusilla, Agrippina the Younger, and Julia Livilla, names that should have been honored as noble women of the Julio-Claudian line, became infamous for the roles the emperor forced upon them. With Drusilla, the bond was more than whispered affection. Caligula treated her as though she were his wife, elevating her above all other women of Rome. She dined beside him at state banquets, appeared in public, adorned with honors typically reserved for the empress, and was paraded before ambassadors as if to remind them that even family was a possession to be displayed. Rumors swirled that she was his partner in every sense, and while historians argue about the details, the perception was enough to shatter Rome's moral compass. In June of 38 CE, Drusilla died, suddenly perhaps from illness. The grief Caligula displayed was raw and unsettling. He declared her a goddess, Diva Drusilla, and ordered temples and a formal priesthood in her name. Citizens were commanded to mourn her death as if she were Rome itself. Senators swore oaths by her divinity, priests sacrificed in her honor, and statues were raised to her in every province. The city had seen emperors mourn before, but never had private grief been transformed into such compulsory ritual. For Romans, it was not only excessive, it was sacrilege, a profanation of their most sacred religious boundaries. The violation deepened with his surviving sisters Agrippina and Livilla. After Drusilla's death, Caligula compelled them to take part in ceremonies that reenacted scenes of intimacy he claimed to have shared with Drusilla. These performances, staged in front of terrified nobles, were not only grotesque spectacles, but direct assaults on the taboos that defined Roman society. by making Rome's most sacred prohibitions into theatre Caligula, flaunted his power over every law, human and divine. The emperor's claim to divinity only magnified the outrage. In Rome, emperors were deified after death as a mark of respect. To demand worship while alive was an affront to tradition. Caligula did more than demand worship, he restructured religion itself. Temples once devoted to Jupiter and Mars were ordered to erect altars to Gaius Caesar. Worshippers were instructed to sacrifice in his name. Coins were minted bearing his likeness as a god. Some sources even claim he sought to place his statue in the Temple of Jerusalem, a move so provocative it nearly sparked rebellion in Judea. What made this all the more abhorrent to Romans was the method by which he corrupted religious rites. Temple prostitution, unknown in traditional Roman worship, was introduced as an act of devotion to the emperor. Vestal virgins whose chastity had been guarded for centuries as a cornerstone of Rome's prosperity found themselves targeted by his advances. If the purity of the Vestals could be destroyed, what boundary remained? For a society that believed Rome's strength flowed from its religious order, the balance between gods, families, and the state. Caligula's actions were existential threats. Incest, divinization, sacrilege. Each step was not only an offense, but a deliberate signal that nothing was untouchable. Where Augustus had cloaked absolute power in tradition and piety, Caligula tore the veil away. Historians often argue whether these stories were exaggerated by later writers eager to justify his assassination. But whether fact or propaganda, the truth remains that Caligula projected himself as above gods and men alike. His grief became doctrine. His desires became ritual. His family became theatre, and in doing so, he shattered the invisible contracts that bound Roman society together. Rome had endured cruel emperors before. What it had not endured was an emperor who mocked its deepest taboos and demanded reverence for the mockery. Caligula's excesses were never just about indulgence. They were weapons. His treatment of Rome's nobility revealed a mind that understood the mechanics of power better than the Senate itself. He discovered that humiliation could be more effective than execution, and desire could be twisted into a tool sharper than the sword. One of his most ruthless methods was to force senators and equestrians to surrender their wives or even their daughters as proofs of loyalty. A husband might be summoned to the palace only to watch his wife escorted into the emperor's chamber. Refusal was treason. Compliance, however, was no safeguard, for Caligula would later boast publicly of the encounter, mocking the cuckolded senator in front of his peers. Rome's ruling elite, once proud guardians of Mos Maiorum, the ancestral code of honor, found themselves trapped in a cycle of submission, blackmail, and shame. These encounters were not private affairs, but deliberately weaponized events. Caligula ensured that senators knew their reputations could be destroyed at will. Those who resisted risked fabricated charges of adultery or treason crimes punishable by exile or death. In the twisted irony of Roman law, an emperor who violated every marriage could prosecute others for failing to protect theirs. By subverting the sanctity of marriage itself, he turned Rome's most sacred institution into a lever of domination. But Caligula's ambitions did not stop at Rome's palaces. He projected his cruelty outward, building symbols of his control in spectacles as grand as they were grotesque. Most infamous was the so-called pleasure fleet, a series of massive floating palaces anchored in the Bay of Naples. These barges, outfitted with marble colonnades, gilded halls and chambers dedicated to indulgence, became theatres of orgiastic display. Feasts turned into marathons of debauchery, where nobles, soldiers, slaves and captives mingled without distinction. Attendance was mandatory for those summoned. Once aboard, escape was impossible until the emperor gave permission. The fleet, in effect, was a floating prison disguised as luxury. The cost of such extravagance was staggering. Exotic slaves were purchased at sums that could have funded entire campaigns. Craftsmen who should have been designing aqueducts or fortifications found themselves constructing devices of pleasure. Gold that might have secured the frontiers was poured into gilded ceilings and mechanical marvels that entertained the emperor's fleeting whims. Rome's treasury, once replenished by the discipline of Augustus, drained at an alarming rate under Caligula's appetites. Yet the financial damage was only part of the collapse. The corruption of administrative systems proved far more insidious. Governors and generals officials who should have been managing provinces and commanding legions were reduced to procurers sending tributes of young men and women to please the emperor. The machinery of empire, honed over centuries of conquest and governance, was repurposed to sustain one man's private theatre of humiliation. Foreign policy too suffered. Ambassadors returning from Rome carried not tales of majesty, but of degradation. To dine at the imperial court was to risk being dragged into spectacles designed to shock and dominate. One delegation from Parthia, Rome's formidable eastern rival, was reportedly subjected to a dinner where noblewomen were paraded like slaves. When the Parthians protested, Caligula mocked them with threats of mutilation. What should have been diplomacy became humiliation, and humiliation bred instability across Rome's borders. Through it all, the message was unmistakable. Loyalty was measured not by service, but by submission. Rome's elite had to prove devotion, not in words or deeds, but in their willingness to endure disgrace. And as long as the Senate sat silent, as long as generals bowed their heads, Caligula knew he was untouchable. It was not the sword that kept Rome quiet. It was the terror of shame wielded with precision by a man who understood that to enslave a people, it was enough to enslave their dignity. Caligula's appetites did not stop at Rome's walls. The empire itself became his hunting ground, its people a reservoir from which he could draw victims at will. When he travelled, governors were expected to prepare tributes of the most attractive youths as though they were offerings to a god. Those who failed to meet his standards risked dismissal, exile, or execution. The message was clear. The emperor's desires outweighed the dignity of entire provinces. One chilling account survives from Syria. When news arrived that Caligula planned a visit, the governor ordered villagers to produce their sons and daughters for imperial inspection. Families who resisted found themselves crucified along the roadside, their corpses displayed as a warning. Entire settlements were depopulated of their youth, marched away to camps where they would be trained for service in the emperor's retinue. Many never returned. What Rome once demanded in taxes and military levies was now extracted in flesh. The military, too, was not spared. Discipline, once the cornerstone of Rome's legions, eroded under the emperor's perversions. Caligula would arrive at encampments demanding that the handsomest recruits be sent to him. Officers who resisted were humiliated or dismissed. Those who complied betrayed the trust of their men. In some units, near mutinies erupted as soldiers refused to surrender their comrades to degradation. Even the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own protectors, were forced into complicity, standing watch as their charge indulged in acts that violated every oath they had sworn to uphold. For many, the greatest strain was not the threat of death in battle, but the torment of watching the emperor destroy the very citizens they were meant to protect. The consequences rippled outward. Rome's reputation, once its greatest asset, began to fray. Foreign envoys who witnessed the emperor's conduct returned to their homelands with tales of debasement. Allies hesitated, calculating whether Rome's friendship was worth exposure to such shame. Enemies, by contrast, saw opportunity. Rebellions stirred in provinces where loyalty had once been unquestioned. To them, the emperor's behavior was proof that Rome was not invincible. It was distracted, consumed by its own corruption. Behind these horrors lay a pattern. Caligula's reach was total, and no distance from Rome guaranteed safety. Families in Gaul or Judea might have believed themselves beyond the emperor's notice, only to discover that a single imperial summons could tear their children from them. Governors competed in their servility, offering up human tributes as though generosity in degradation would shield them from suspicion. It was not enough for Caligula to dominate Rome's nobility. He wanted to demonstrate that the entire empire from Britain to Syria was vulnerable to his whims. For the subjects of Rome, this was a devastating betrayal. The empire had always been harsh, often exploitative, but it carried with it a promised Roman order in exchange for loyalty. Under Caligula, that order disintegrated. What remained was fear, arbitrary and boundless. To be a Roman citizen no longer meant protection under law. It meant exposure to the emperor's gaze. And for those who suffered it, the knowledge was unbearable that the same empire, which had built aqueducts, roads and cities which promised civilization and stability, now treated its people as little more than raw material for one man's depravity. By the late years of Caligula's reign, the empire was not only bleeding wealth and dignity, it was unraveling from within. The emperor's systematic abuses had created something more corrosive than economic strain or political instability, a society paralyzed by shame. For Rome's nobility, the effects were devastating. Suicide became common among senators and equestrians who could no longer endure the degradation of their families. Ancient physicians began reporting unprecedented cases of melancholia, a catch-all for despair, anxiety and sleeplessness. Families that had stood proudly for generations, men who had commanded legions, women descended from Rome's founders, collapsed under the weight of humiliation. Some entire households chose death by poison, slipping away together, rather than face another summons to the palace. Women bore the sharpest edge of this terror. Roman matrons had long been celebrated for their dignity and chastity virtues, bound to the honor of their households. Under Caligula, these ideals became liabilities. To be beautiful was dangerous, to be virtuous was to invite mockery. Many women resorted to desperate strategies, feigning illness, disfiguring themselves, or retreating into obscurity in hopes of avoiding imperial notice. Yet even these measures could fail. A senator's wife, no matter how deliberately plain, could be demanded at the emperor's whim. Some women, stripped of choice, turned their suffering into quiet resistance. Secret networks formed among those who had already been degraded and thus held little left to lose. They warned families when their names appeared on palace lists, smuggled girls out of the city, and offered refuge to survivors. Their efforts, perilous and fragile, became flickers of humanity in a society otherwise suffocated by fear. Children, perhaps the most innocent victims, endured trauma that would ripple across generations. Caligula's so-called training programs shattered boundaries meant to protect youth. Accounts describe youngsters subjected to conditioning that blurred the lines between service and slavery, preparing them for a lifetime of violation. Those who resisted were punished publicly, often before the eyes of their parents, forcing mothers and fathers into silence as their children's spirits were broken. The psychological scars lingered long after. Survivors as adults often withdrew from society, unable to form bonds of trust or intimacy. Some perpetuated cycles of abuse, repeating horrors they had been taught as children. Modern readers would recognize their symptoms as post-traumatic stress nightmares, dissociation, uncontrollable panic at sudden touches. For ancient Rome, which lacked the language of trauma, these victims were simply seen as broken souls. Even religion. Rome's anchor of identity fractured under the weight of corruption. Priests who had devoted their lives to the gods were forced into ceremonies that mocked everything sacred. Vestal virgins, symbols of Rome's eternal flame, were desecrated, and temples turned into theatres of lust. Some priests chose martyrdom, refusing to comply. Most submitted, knowing that defiance meant not only death for themselves, but ruin for their congregations. Faith, once Rome's bedrock, gave way to disillusionment. Many turned to foreign mystery cults that promised salvation from earthly horrors. Traditional Roman religion, already strained by imported practices, suffered wounds from which it never fully recovered. Even the arts, once flourishing under imperial patronage, became tools of degradation. Sculptors were ordered to carve obscene statues, painters to decorate chambers with grotesque scenes, poets to compose verses in praise of perversion. Some tried to resist through subtle symbolism, embedding hidden critiques in their work. But Caligula's paranoia was sharp. Suspected subversives were punished brutally, hands crushed, tongues cut out, eyes gouged. Creativity, once Rome's pride, became another casualty of fear. What emerged from these years was not merely a tyrant's court, but a traumatized society. Rome's elites were silenced by shame, its women weaponized as instruments of control, its children marked by generational wounds, its faith corrupted, and its culture bent into servitude. The empire's external strength still impressed the world, but within its very soul was fracturing. Caligula had discovered the darkest truth of power, that an empire could be broken not only by swords and rebellions, but by the slow, systematic destruction of its people's dignity. By the final phase of Caligula's reign, Rome existed in a state of suspended terror. What had begun as whispers of private vice and displays of eccentricity had spiraled into public spectacles that combined sex violence and mockery of every sacred tradition. The emperor, no longer content with humiliating Rome's elite behind palace walls, began staging performances meant to traumatize the entire city. The amphitheater, already a place of bloodshed, became a stage for his experiments. Ancient accounts speak of audiences forced to watch scenes that blurred the line between entertainment and atrocity. Caligula compelled parents to sit with their children as educational performances unfolded before them, acts so disturbing that mothers tried to cover their children's eyes only to be struck down by guards. Those who wept too openly or who attempted to leave were executed on the spot. Attendance was mandatory, absence noted and punished as treason. Rome, the proud capital of the Mediterranean, had become a captive audience to its emperor's madness. The emperor's paranoia also deepened. Conspiracies, real or imagined, seemed to surround him. Senators were accused of treason on flimsy evidence, their estates confiscated. The Praetorian Guard, once his protectors, grew uneasy, forced to witness horrors that made their loyalty hollow. Caligula responded with ever more grandiose gestures of power, declaring campaigns against the sea itself, ordering legions to collect seashells as spoils of war. What to his mind was divine theatre to Rome was humiliation on the world stage. The tipping point came with his announcement to relocate the empire's capital to Alexandria. In Egypt, he believed he would finally be worshipped as the living God he proclaimed himself to be. To Romans, this was unthinkable. The heart of empire, the sacred city of Romulus and Augustus, abandoned for the Nile. It was a betrayal that struck deeper than any personal scandal. Senators who had endured humiliation, generals who had suffered disgrace, even the Praetorian officers who had long remained silent, all recognized that if Rome lost its emperor to Alexandria, it might lose the empire itself. Thus, for the first time in years, unity emerged among the fractured elite. Senators, soldiers, and palace officials groups, usually at odds, found common cause in survival. Their silence had enabled Caligula's reign, but his latest ambition made clear that silence now meant extinction. The conspiracy was hatched in shadows, a network of men bound not by loyalty or ideology, but by desperation. The assassination was brutal, as though Rome sought to purge years of humiliation in a single act. On January 24th, 41 CE, in a palace corridor, conspirators struck. Caligula was stabbed repeatedly. Suetonius claims 30 times until his body was unrecognizable. The violence was not simply to ensure his death. It was vengeance aimed at the very parts of him that had wrought such suffering. His wife and infant daughter were murdered as well, a grim decision born of fear that any remnant of his line might rally loyalists or resurrect the nightmare. For a moment, Rome erupted. Statues of the emperor were toppled and smashed, his name cursed in the streets. Senators debated whether to abolish the Principate altogether, as if Rome could erase not only the man, but the system that had allowed him. But the trauma he had inflicted could not be so easily undone. Institutions remained corrupted, the people scarred, the shame still silencing many. The man who had once been Rome's great hope had in less than 4 years brought the empire to the brink of spiritual collapse. And though his life ended in a bloody corridor, the shadows he cast over Rome would linger long after his body was gone. The death of Caligula did not bring immediate healing. If anything, it exposed the depth of Rome's wounds. The conspirators who struck him down. Senators, praetorians, palace officials had ended the man, but not the system that enabled him. The empire awoke the next morning, not to freedom, but to a vacuum. In the streets, rage erupted. Statues of the emperor were dragged down and smashed. His images defaced, his name spat like a curse. The Senate debated, declaring damnatio memoriae, the erasure of his memory from Rome's records. Yet, as they argued, the Praetorian Guard, fearful of losing their influence, placed Caligula's uncle Claudius on the throne. Rome's first imperial assassination had not restored the Republic. It had merely shifted the crown to another. Claudius inherited an empire traumatized. The treasury was nearly bankrupt, drained by Caligula's spectacles and fleets. The army was demoralized, its discipline corroded by years of humiliation. Diplomats abroad reported that Rome's prestige had been mocked in foreign courts. But the most difficult damage to repair was invisible: the moral collapse within Rome itself. Families, broken women, shamed children, scarred priests, corrupted the social fabric that had bound Rome together, was frayed beyond recognition. For many victims, there was no justice. Roman society had no framework for acknowledging, let alone repairing, mass sexual trauma. Survivors bore their pain in silence, their suffering compounded by shame. Some were further marginalized, blamed for the very abuses they had endured. Even as Claudius tried to restore order, he relied on many of the same officials who had enabled Caligula, men bound together by shared complicity. Stability took precedence over justice. Religion too bore scars. Temples defiled under Caligula's hand could be reconsecrated, but faith itself was harder to mend. Many Romans, disillusioned by gods who had allowed such sacrilege, turned to foreign cults that promised personal salvation. In this religious fragmentation, seeds were planted for future shifts that would one day reshape the empire. Historians who wrote after Caligula's death struggled with how to preserve the truth. Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Josephus recorded horrors, but often confessed that some details were too terrible to put into words. Modern scholars debate exaggeration versus accuracy, recognizing that propaganda may have darkened his legacy further. Yet archaeology fragments of official records and the sheer consistency of multiple independent sources point to a grim reality. The truth was not less horrific than the accounts, it was likely worse. What lessons remain from this darkest reign? First, that unchecked power corrodes not only rulers but institutions. Rome's laws, traditions, and values, centuries in the making, were powerless against an emperor who weaponized shame. Second, that silence in the face of abuse enables its spread. Senators who bowed their heads to survive found themselves complicit in their own dishonour. And third, that trauma lingers far beyond the tyrant who inflicts it. Caligula's reign lasted barely 4 years, yet its scars shaped Rome for generations. And yet, within this darkness, there were glimmers of resilience. Families who protected each other in secret. Artists who risked subtle acts of defiance. Priests who chose martyrdom over sacrilege. Even in the most oppressive conditions, some found ways to resist, however small. Their courage overshadowed by horror reminds us that humanity can endure even when crushed beneath tyranny. To study Caligula is to confront uncomfortable truths, that societies can tolerate monstrosity when bound by fear and shame, that institutions we believe strong may collapse under the pressure of one man's depravity, but also that survival and recovery, however imperfect, are possible. Rome did not fall with Caligula. It staggered, bled, and remembered. The story of Little Boots is not only a cautionary tale about a mad emperor, it is a mirror showing how fragile dignity can be when fear reigns, and how vital it is to guard against silence, complicity, and the normalization of the unthinkable. For if Rome could fracture under shame, so too can any civilization that forgets the lessons of its darkest chapters.